Now, let us again consider the problem of evil and the explanations offered by our wisdom traditions, as well as the solutions to remedy it. So let's cast our gaze back onto ancient Mesopotamia, and that's the milieu that gave us the Epic of Gilgamesh. And there we find the Babylonian creation story, where a conflict between the oldest generation of gods, Apsu, and his consort Tiamat, plotted to wipe out the younger generation of gods because they were just too noisy. The younger gods resisted, and one of them killed Apsu, but they could not defeat the more powerful Tiamat. And so they turned to a still younger generation of gods, imploring Marduk to help them. Marduk agreed to fight Tiamat if they all agreed to make him the king of the gods. And they did. Marduk defeated Tiamat and dismembered her body, using its parts to form the world. And out of that stuff, humans were created. Thus, there is an element of badness inherent in all of us and in everything that is around. Turning to the Buddhist tradition, we find the problem of evil rooted in the illusion of the self and the desires stemming from that. That is the source of the human problem. The travesties and the horrors and the injustice of the world starkly manifests the very problem of the self and the selfish and destructive behavior that stems from it. And the Buddha taught the Four Noble Truths to understand the nature of reality and the Eightfold Path, which teaches mindfulness and wisdom and core ethical standards as our guide for liberation from the prison of the self, from the torment it brings and the damnation that comes from it. Recall how before he became the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama achieved these insights while meditating under the Bodhi tree. And there, as he approached enlightenment, Siddhartha was furiously besieged by Mara, the demonic power of this world. Mara recognized how this enlightenment would undermine Mara's nefarious power in this world. Thus, he threw everything that he could at Siddhartha to shake his concentration, to lure him back to the world of the self, tempting him with sensual pleasures, threatening him with violence, and casting doubt into his mind. But Siddhartha resisted temptation and triumphed over Mara, and by doing so, became the awakened one. He became the Buddha, who taught the way out of the prison of the self, which is embroiled in Mara's power, and liberation from the wheel of samsara. In this, one is reminded of the gospel accounts of Jesus, who before beginning his ministry was taken to the desert to fast, and there he was tempted by Satan, who also aimed at luring Jesus away. And Jesus also resisted these temptations, and then after, as with the Buddha, began his work of redemption and salvation immediately following. For the Greek tradition, let's recall Socrates, as presented by Plato, who taught that evil was a matter of ignorance. We do wrong because we have not come to know what is truly right. That is, until we are guided by reason, the highest part of our soul, our judgment is impaired and clouded by the baser aspects of the soul. The role of the philosopher is to help align our soul so that we can recognize what is truly right, and then we will act on it. In contrast, Aristotle offered an alternative perspective, namely, that we know right from wrong but we choose to do wrong because of a failure of will. It is not sufficient to know what is right. We have to act on it. And this requires us to cultivate and practice virtue. Practicing what is right makes it stick. But this requires both knowledge and effort. Without knowing what we are to do, and without having a willingness to work at doing it, we will always miss the mark. And in Greek, missing the mark is hamartia. And this also has an ethical dimension. And it is that dimension that it always carries in the Christian scriptures, where hamartia is translated as sin. So now, let's turn to those scriptures and its explanation of evil. The New Testament places particular emphasis on an evil being known as the devil, or Satan, or Beelzebul, and those three are mentioned 79 times in the New Testament, which contains many additional references by other names, such as the tempter, the evil one, the god of this world, among others. Turning specifically to the letters of Paul, we learn that sin has a firm grip on humanity, through which it enslaves and oppresses, preventing humans from flourishing. And Paul locates the origin of sin in the defiance of Adam and Eve, as we found in the book of Genesis. God provided the first humans with the bounty that was the Garden of Eden, and he offered it all to them, only withholding from them, you recall, the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and bad. Yet, when tempted by a serpent in the garden, Adam and Eve broke this divine command. They ate of the fruit. And what was the significance of this act? Well, first, Adam and Eve defied God. They refused to accept and acknowledge that any boundary set by God should be an obstacle to their immediate desires. And perhaps they would have later been granted access to the fruit, but their impatience, their failure to wait and delay gratification, the supplanting of their own will in place of God's, led to their expulsion from Eden and a troubled path for humanity. The book of Genesis does not offer any explicit interpretation of the serpent. But for Paul and the Christian tradition, it is clear. The serpent is Satan. And through this temptation in Eden, this fall, sin and death entered the human realm and became the agents of evil. And this is why there is so much moral confusion everywhere. Paul writes in his letter to the Romans, chapter 7, "For I know that nothing good lives in me, that is, in my sinful nature. For I have the desire to do what is good, but I cannot carry it out. For what I do is not the good I want to do. No, the evil I do not want to do, this I keep on doing. Now, if I do what I do not want to do, it is no longer I who do it, but it is sin that lives in me that does it." Every person inherits some sort of corrupted spiritual DNA from Adam and Eve's failure, which gives us a tendency towards sin. And in addition, we're further besieged by Satan, the god of this world, who seeks to deceive, to pervert, to prevent our escape from the trap of sin and death and damnation. Satan, then, is our tormentor and oppressor and the steadfast opponent of the faithful. But Paul teaches that there is a solution. Since Jesus lived a sin-free life and then died and was resurrected, he proved that sin and death, which are Satan's essential tools, had no power over him. And then by faith in Jesus, believers gain a path out of death and out of eternal damnation. For Paul, faith is the beginning of liberation, and Christians' belief manifests in action. Paul declares that Christians must live by a higher ethical standard that reveals that they're no longer following the desires of flesh. Paul and the early church expressed great concern for ethical conduct, which was already called for in the teachings of Jesus, who located sin not only in action, but even in thought itself. Believers must root out evil at the level of thought by establishing pure habits or states of mind in pursuit of a pure or holy life. In this process of sanctification or purification, I'm reminded of the Analects, Book 2, Chapter 4, where Confucius says, "At 15, I set my mind on learning. By 30, I had found my footing. At 40, I was free of perplexities. By 50, I understood the will of heaven. By 60, I learned to give ear to others. By 70, I could follow my heart's desires without overstepping the line." The idea is that by age 70, Confucius's intentions had been so thoroughly grounded in what was right, so purified, that the ideals and his own thoughts and actions had become in complete harmony. For Christians, this process begins with belief in Jesus and then manifests in the ethics by which they live. In this way, the Christian community participates in a cosmic struggle between God and Christ on the one side and the principalities and powers in the world led by Satan on the other. Satan's hold may have been broken by the work of Jesus, but his power is still very real as it confronts each individual who must choose how to respond to the temptations of this world.